Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marcia Hashemi. The countdown to the French presidential election is underway, and one of the candidates from the National Front Party, Marine Le Pen, has kicked off her campaign. She is a far-right nationalist who believes that her time has come. With the winds of change sweeping the world, we saw the Brexit vote in the UK, and Donald Trump elected president in the US. Will we see a President Le Pen in France? Stay with us as we take a look at that possibility.
France's controversial presidential candidate from the far-right National Front Party has begun her campaign after the primaries by making a speech to her supporters in the city of Lyon. Le Pen has attracted much attention with her vision for France, which has somehow polarized the country and caused concern among other EU members. Le Pen has said at her National Front Party's conference in Lyon that France is threatened by, quote, totalitarianisms in the form of economic globalization and Islamic fundamentalism. Le Pen added that those threats are planting themselves in some neighborhoods and vulnerable minds. She listed the veil some Muslim women wear in mosques and prayer in the streets of France as unacceptable cultural dangers, quote, no French person attached to his dignity can accept. Apart from her Islamophobic views, Le Pen is notorious for having applauded US President Donald Trump's controversial travel ban and said a backlash to the measure was in, quote, bad faith. Meanwhile, the leader of the far-right Front National Party has made some promises which have caused further concerns. No more membership in NATO's integrated command. No more euro currency, European Union or open borders. Immigration, especially by Muslims, would be contained. And no more second chances for foreigners under surveillance as suspected potential terrorists. Those thousands would be expelled. Unlike Trump, Le Pen isn't a new figure in French politics. She has headed the anti-immigrant party since 2011 and came in third in the presidential vote in 2012. Early polls consistently show Le Pen among two top presidential candidates, but suggest she'll lose by a wide margin in the May 7 runoff. The candidate who was just 2 weeks ago considered the most likely to beat Le Pen and win was former Conservative Prime Minister François Fillon. He has seen his support plummet as prosecutors investigate possibly fake parliamentary aid jobs once held by his wife and two children. Now former Budget Minister Emmanuel Macron, who rebelled against the Socialist Party to strike out on his own, could end up facing Le Pen in the second round vote. Also running for the French presidency are leftists Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Benoît Hamon. These are not considered as strong rivals for Le Pen, who will be facing off Macron as the main competitor in the runoff.
Ce sera la France.
I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. Out of Paris, journalist and political analyst Mr. Gerard Coleman. And out of New York, professor of political science, William Patterson University, Mr. John Mason. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in New York. Mr. Mason, isn't it true that Le Pen has appealed because indeed French are actually quite nationalist in general?
I think her appeal is interesting because she has managed to make an appeal to traditionally left-wing strongholds. For instance, the Pas-de-Calais around Lille used to be a socialist fiefdom. National Front has shown a lot of strength there. This is also true for places like Lyon. So in a sense, we see a parallel between her appeal to former left-wing, even communist, working-class voters, and some of what we've seen with Mr. Trump in the United States.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to get back to actually that point that you've made. Gerard, Mr. Coleman, when we look at the situation, you've heard what our guest has said in New York, it seems to be an interesting phenomenon taking place, that a lot of times we have this crossover from the left to the right. But basically, it seems that people around the world are feeling that globalization has not actually benefited them, but only the super rich, and they want to concentrate on their own borders now. How do you assess this?
I think I've mentioned this example before, but in 2011, if you were new to French politics and you were watching the television debates, in 2011, Marine Le Pen was debating Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was one of her opponents on the so-called left. And Mélenchon was defending the French bombing of Libya. He was coming out in favor of the bombing of Libya. Okay? And Marine Le Pen was against it. She was criticizing it. So you would have thought that Marine Le Pen was left-wing, or was the far left, and Mélenchon was the far right. So this is the kind of contradiction we're in. You find increasingly that the policy defended by Marine Le Pen are closer to traditional left-wing policies. So, for example, criticism of immigration. Well, this is presented as far right, but in France, it was the Communist Party who held this position for years. The French Communist Party was critical of immigration because they saw it as an attack on the working class. That's why the working class increasingly support Marine Le Pen. So you have all kinds of contradictions there. Other issues, for example, which are never discussed in the media, are issues like the family. A significant section of the Muslim population in France are against the new theory of gender, which is being imposed in schools. So you have Marine Le Pen, even though she's considered Islamophobic, she's gaining significant support from French Algerians who do not want who see this as an attack on the family, and family values are very important for France's Muslim population. You also have many Muslims in France who want an end to mass immigration because it's threatening their interests as well. So it is not just a question of the Français de souche, as it were, the French of origin, people of French origin historically, versus the immigrant flows coming into the country. You also have a significant section of the French population that has come from immigration in recent years from Algeria and Morocco, who are also quite nationalist in the sense they wanted, France to defend its borders and so on. Just another point in terms of the left-right dichotomy here. The financial policies of Marine Le Pen are also left-wing policies. We must understand that traditionally the far right was the financial oligarchy. So we're living under a far right regime. The actual financial policies of Marine Le Pen again are actually more left-wing. The law of 1973, which requires the French state to borrow money from private international financiers in order to finance the budget, is the reason why the state is now in 100% debt and can't make any progress. So, all of these things are never discussed by the media.
All right, very interesting points. What about that, John Mason, what our guest in Paris has talked about? There seems to be, on the one hand, Le Pen is portrayed as being xenophobic, Islamophobic. And then, as Mr. O'Cullinan had said, we see that connection, for example, with, as he said, a lot of Muslims, a lot of Algerians there, because of the socially conservative policies that she might actually get support from some of them. Let's talk about that aspect of it.
Well, let me make a general comment first. I agree with my colleague who just spoke that we're looking at a sort of breakdown of the traditional left-right cleavage that has defined, say, politics in France. In the United States, it would have been a north-south cleavage, dating back to the Civil War. However, I think John Judis, in his recent book, The Populist Explosion, makes an interesting distinction that might be helpful here. He talks about right-wing populist movements that are, of course, mobilizing, quote, the people, the folk, against cosmopolitan liberal elites that are seen as responsible of a betrayal of the working class. But usually those right-wing movements have an additional enemy, which is groups of foreigners, foreign immigrants, people of color, etc., non-Christians in both the United States and France, who are seen as the pets of the neoliberal global elites. So right-wing populism tends to be triadic. It's the people against the top and the fringe. Left-wing populism, and I think, you know, if you listen to Jean-Luc Mélenchon or Armand Benoit or even Bernie Sanders in the United States, that's much more of a dyadic mobilization of broadly the working people, the middle classes against elites. So that's dyadic. I think Marine Le Pen falls into the right-wing populist mode. Whatever gestures she might make toward Muslim traditionalists, her basic policy is to restore the dominance in France of French Catholic people of old stock. She has recently made moves to include Jews in that category, but it's basically an anti-Islamic front against the Muslim community, which is the largest in Europe, although we don't have an exact count, and against liberal elites, globalizers, who are seen as having betrayed La Nation in favor of, I don't know, Davos or the UN or the European Union. So I think that would be a more helpful way to frame the discussion. And we're seeing the same thing in the United States. If we look at Trump, it's not only illegal immigrants that they're concerned about. Increasingly, what they're concerned about is the percentage of foreign-born citizens in the United States. And what they're trying to figure out is a way really of getting a lot of people who hold green cards to leave.
Okay. You brought up some interesting points also, Mr. John Mason. One of them I want to pick up on and talking about how, for example, some of these far-right parties have actually, you talked about Le Pen and how actually in this Nationalist Party now that they're very inclusive of Jews. Mr. O'Coleman, you know, these far-right parties in Europe had always been nationalist in nature, anti-immigrant, and actually whose roots were also anti-Semitic in the late 80s and early 90s. We saw these parties, such as the National Front in France, sort of switch from being anti-Semitic and actually becoming pro-Israel and then anti-Muslim. Your take on all of this and what has been behind this and the significance of it in what we're seeing now?
It is highly significant, and I've highlighted this repeatedly. Marine Le Pen is close to Israel. The vice president of the Front National is close to Netanyahu. He's close to a French politician who's very close to Netanyahu, Goldnagel, who's very, very influential in the French Jewish community. The French Jewish community, of course, is the ruling caste in France at this stage. They have huge power and influence over the media and policy, French foreign policy. And it is a big problem. I mean, you're technically not allowed to criticize them. And these people, of course, because they have such power, you can't really get anywhere in mainstream politics if you're not in their pay or if you're not going to do their bidding. So this is something that people should be aware of with Marine Le Pen, is that she is a Zionist. She appears to be very close to Israel and increasingly so, as is, of course, Trump. And this is an aspect of it. I agree with my colleague there that there is the Islamophobic agenda as well in Marine Le Pen, and an attempt to scapegoat immigrants. But I think there's another aspect that needs to be discussed as well, and that is that in terms of ideas, it's hard to see how Marine Le Pen would be a victory for the establishment, in the sense that if she cuts off support for Saudi Arabia and Qatar, if relations with those countries are ruptured by a Le Pen administration, it would, I think, damage the whole agenda of the war on terror, which is Israel's agenda. I mean, let's be honest, the war on terror is essentially an Israeli project of global domination. of regional domination in the Middle East, but also global domination. So that if for example, Marine Le Pen were to do business with Russia, were to restore peace in Syria, then that would not be in Israel's interest. Israel wants to destroy Syria, it wants to wipe it from the face of the earth, it wants to attack Iran. Of course, we're seeing contradictions in these populist movements. Look at Trump. He's now focusing on China and Iran, and there's a major push towards aggression against China on Trump's part. So there are all kinds of countervailing forces at play here right now. I think, just to come back to the other point made by my colleague on Benoît Hamon and Mélenchon. Mélenchon is a Trotskyist, and the reason why we have no coherent left-wing force in France is because of Trotskyism. It is because of the 1968 movement. It's this petty bourgeois leftism that really is extremely hypocritical and is perfectly prepared to support wars of conquest and wars of colonialism when they're disguised as humanitarian operations such as Libya and Syria. Mélenchon has, of course, been very complicit in supporting these wars, as has the entire left-wing, official left-wing movement. In the Fête de l'Humanité, which is the big communist festival a few years ago, I was astonished to see a stand dedicated to the so-called rebels in Syria. I mean, it is absolutely shameful. The French Communist Party supporting these reactionary terrorists in the service of NATO in Syria.
All right, well, let me get Mr. Mason back in on this, because my time is moving very fast.
As a petty bourgeois leftist, let me make a couple comments on this. First of all, I think there's no contradiction between being pro-Israeli and being anti-Semitic, and that's true in France, and it's true in the United States.
So you can be pro-Israeli and anti-Semitic, you're saying, at the same time.
It works like this. You give me a second.
Go ahead.
What we're dealing with is the emergence of these kind of ethno-nationalist movements, which claim to speak in the name of some majority people or folk, an ethnic majority. For people in the United States, that would mean the generic American, the traditional America that they want to see restored is European, primarily Western European, and Christian. Right? But if they look at Israel and you're an evangelical Christian, the creation of the State of Israel is the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy which points toward the end times and Christ's return to earth. So you can support the State of Israel. You could even support building a third temple on El Quds, on the Temple Mount, on the grounds that will accelerate the end time and the return of Christ a second time, and the final battle and the apocalypse and so forth. It's odd. It mirrors the ISIS discourse in a way, about the final battle to keep. Anyway, an ethno-nationalist would say, hey, Jews have their own national community now. It's Israel. So they would support American Jews doing the Aliyah and immigrating to Israel. And Bibi Netanyahu would be perfectly happy with that. That was his message to the Grand Synagogue in Paris when he came last winter. And of course, their response was to drown him out by singing the Marseillaise, all right, the French national anthem. So there is this kind of ethno-nationalism. And I think that it's also true probably for people around Le Pen.
Okay, in just 1 minute, Mr. Mason, because we're just about out of time. Do you think Le Pen actually has a chance of becoming president? 1 minute, sir.
No, not this time. Next election, maybe, 2025. I think she will do very well in the second round. I think she'll get 40%.
Okay, and let me turn to Mr. Coleman. Your take on that. Does she have a chance of becoming president?
Everything depends on the kind of foreign policy pursued by Trump in the next few months. What happens in the United States is going to be vital for her campaign. But I agree with your colleague on many of the points he makes about ethno-nationalism. I don't think that is incoherent at all. But I think that one of the aspects that needs to be discussed, and it isn't being discussed, is the Zionist agenda behind the war on terrorism. Le Pen is focusing on Muslims. She should be focusing on that agenda more, and instead of scapegoating Muslims in France.
Okay. I'm so sorry I have to interrupt you, and hopefully we can actually have another program and discussing that very subject. For now, I thank both of you for being with us. Out of Paris, Mr. Gerardo Coleman, journalist and political analyst, and out of New York, professor of political science at William Patterson University, Mr. John Mason. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks so much and goodbye.